Is it recording?
Yes.
Thank you, Arda. So we've now reached the point in HMR1 where we begin to think through the legacies of colonialism. And we had a wonderful class meeting on Wednesday where we listened to the very wise words of Chinua Achebe, the great critic of Joseph Conrad, who, a great realization as he was reading this important piece of so-called world literature, realized that he wasn't on the boat with Marlowe. He was on the shore with the heathens that Kurtz demanded be exterminated. So part of that conversation that I thought was very interesting, and I think really points to some of our ongoing discussions about the legacies of colonialism and the impact of colonialism as a human wrong, but then also on the possibilities of engaging and developing human rights in what we call the post-colony, or the country or the political entity that exists when colonialism leaves. And so he talked about this notion of democracy. Like, why aren't you Nigerians more democratic? And he made the point that colonial rule in Nigeria did not implement the same democracy that British people had back in London or Glasgow or Belfast. No. Instead, there was a colonial administrator that commanded a military that used all sorts of political tricks and forms of oppression and secret policing to keep the local population under control and then extract as much wealth and resources as it possibly could for shareholders in British companies, and then turn Nigeria into a place where finished goods could be exported as well. And also a place where British missionaries could export their version of Christianity, right? And the English language could be taught and spread. So those are among the legacies of colonialism. This, what I call forms of colonial knowledge. Colonialism, and this is I'll go through this very quickly in the hopes that maybe you can talk about this in your sections. That colonialism tends to teach people who are colonized about certain kinds of practices. Among these are forms of human rights abuse, styles of secret policing, authoritarian government, and forms of racist identification and classification. And all of these are certainly present in the kinds of governments and policies that emerged in Central Africa, both in the Congo and in places like Rwanda. And so, as we know from the film, and you really should consider making sure you've watched the entire film, including the sections that deal with the legacies in the era of Mobutu Sese Seko, that you spend some time on that era and think about how his rule might actually resemble the rule at the time of King Leopold. So, Sese Seko's 31-year reign sort of devastated the country. And by 1996, there was what we call the Congolese Civil Wars, or sometimes people call the African World War, in which the states of Africa, Central Africa, and African states as far away as Libya in the north and as far south as Zimbabwe and South Africa in the south, became engaged in sort of a regional wars and civil wars in Africa. This led to 4.5 million people being killed, and ultimately, while peace has been restored to some extent, especially in Congo, it has to be kept by UN peacekeepers. Between the capital of Congo and the border of Rwanda, it's still estimated there are about 20 armed groups, including the ones that we looked at on Monday when we were thinking about humanitarian reporting and we looked at the Human Rights Watch report on the situation in Virunga. So, cutting of arms, racial classification, authoritarian governance, secret policing. These are forms of colonial knowledge. And this leads me to a subsidiary thesis to one of the ones I proposed at the beginning of this section of our class, that colonialism has legacies. The legacies of colonialism exist. But I argue that how colonialism ends, and this is the thesis, how colonialism ends leaves the most important legacies. In other words, it's that process of decolonization in itself which has the most lasting impact on post-colonial societies. So we're going to think about some of those issues in the context of India and the decolonization of India, which was completed, some would argue has never been completed, but was completed at least politically in 1947 when Great Britain officially granted independence to the states of India. So Indian decolonization. And while I've argued, and will still argue, that all decolonization is accompanied by violence, including the decolonization of India, India is also a place where we see other strategies of resistance to colonialism. And in particular, a strategy that we call in the United States, nonviolence. So, at the center of that story, and this is a very complex, very controversial figure, especially amongst contemporary Indians, is a British-trained lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi, who was born in the latter years of the 19th century. So this is Mohandas K. Gandhi, or the Mahatma, the Great One, who's many of you have seen for reasons that still befuddle me. We have his statue in downtown Davis's Central Park, rather than say a statue of someone from Davis. He's, the image of him that most of you have is as a fairly small, skinny man with glasses, wearing a kind of cotton wrap and a cotton loincloth. And that is indeed the image that Gandhi himself wanted to portray. Even though, as a lawyer, he and as a member of the Indian upper middle class certainly could afford a suit and tie. So in fact, his dressing was a very conscious decision on his part. So Mohandas Gandhi had been trained in Britain. Of course, he couldn't, because of racism and discrimination in Britain, would never have found a job there, and took up a position in representing clients amongst the Indian community of South Africa. South Africa was another British colony and would be the home of the racist system of oppression called apartheid. And if you take HMR 134 with me, we spend a lot of time in that class looking at the anti-apartheid movement. So Gandhi was in South Africa and faced tremendous discrimination as an Indian, wondering why he, in Britain, where he could ride any class of train car he wanted, when he was in South Africa, had to ride in a segregated fashion, was also, and this is one of the more less salutary elements of Gandhi's character, wanted to understand why Indians were being treated as poorly as blacks. So he did become exposed to anti-racist and independence organizations in India, and when he returned to India in 1945, in 1921, at 50, he eventually was selected as the leader of the Indian National Congress. And it's around that time is when he started wearing the dhoti, this sort of loincloth, and cotton woven clothes. So just two things. First, why does Gandhi wear these clothes, right? This is part of his image. He wants to be close to the people. But if you remember from one of our very first lectures, it was cotton and the destruction of India's cotton weaving industry, which in fact helped create the basis of modern colonialism, right? India had been one of the great producers of woven cotton cloth prior to industrialization in the West. With industrialization, India became a place that grew cotton, picked cotton, sent it to England where it was transformed into cloth and shirts, and then was sent back to India to be purchased by Indians. So Gandhi adopted that as a way to stress the notion of self-reliance and resistance to British colonialism. So the Indian National Congress was going to be the vehicle for expressing opposition to British colonialism, and though it had been founded in the 1880s, by the 1920s it had become one of the prototypical Congress-type parties. There was one in South Africa, the African National Congress, and one in India that sought to build a broad coalition of interests against European colonialism. So the Indian National Congress, he comes back, and Gandhi in this period begins to ask of Indians to imagine with him a post-colonial Indian society. Now I want to stop for a moment. We have some maps that we've put into the Slack channels. If I were to travel back in time to sort of post-World War I India, to the continent, to the continent of South Asia, or the subcontinent of South Asia, and just walk down the street, and then I ask someone, what are you? What are you? It's unlikely that she or he would answer, I'm an Indian. Instead, they would probably say what? I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm a Hindu, or I'm Gujarati, I'm Punjabi, right? I'm Bengali, right? I'm from somewhere else. I mean, I am from some place, but that place is different from Punjab. It's different from Gujarat. I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Christian, or I'm a Jain or a Sikh, right? So in other words, that this notion of identifying as an Indian was really rather novel, but something that Gandhi asked the people of South Asia to imagine with him as the basis of a post-colonial identity. And that identity would embrace Indian nationalism, in other words, an ideology of nationalism, which we've talked about previously, that would encompass all British colonial India, as well as the princely states, those that were sort of states run by old royalty from the Mughal era or earlier, that had made deals with the British, that all of India, that entire subcontinent, would be one great, powerful country of Indians. And then they would be Gujaratis or Punjabis, whatever, as another identity. And also, this would be a religiously pluralistic society, where it didn't matter if you were a Hindu or a Muslim, and more importantly, it didn't matter if you were in the, according to the Indian caste structure, if you were in the untouchable class, that kind of oppressive system would be eliminated as well. So it was a very modern vision, a very democratic, nationalist, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural vision of what an India could be. And in Gandhi's mind, it was so important to create that all India because it would make India powerful enough to stand on its own against any other colonizing power. So you had this sort of India in his mind, but the problem is you couldn't make India as long as the British were still running India. And this is 1920, right? British colonial interests have been in India for a century. Queen Victoria had traveled to India because India was seen by the British people and the British elite as the jewel in the crown. In other words, it was the most important overseas holding of Great Britain, and they weren't going to get rid of it. They just were not. It was too important to them. It was too important emotionally in terms of nationalism, but it made them money. It created enormous wealth in Great Britain. So Gandhi had to figure out, how are we going to get these guys to leave? So the first thing he realized is that you would have to persuade the British people that it was a good idea to leave and that the Indians could rule themselves. Also, and demonstrate thereby their ability to rule, but also to make it very difficult and ultimately unprofitable for Great Britain to continue its colonial rule in India. Eventually, this would be called the Quit India movement during the 1940s, the very end of the anti-colonial struggle. And their motto was, "Make India ungovernable." Make India ungovernable. But Gandhi also had another, I think, realization early in this process, and that was that if Indians, even if they could, organized into a military force, they would outnumber the British 1,000, 10,000, actually probably more like 100,000 to 1. The average Indian would never have seen a British civil servant his or her life. Never. The British colonial presence in India was very light. You're like, how did they run it? Well, they employed Indians to rule India with them or for them, including an enormous Indian military. And those of you who watch movies about World War I or World War II will often see in battles and in scenes Indian soldiers fighting against Nazis or in the trenches of World War I. So he realized that it would be difficult to fight a war because it would become a civil war, but also because they didn't have access to weapons, and Great Britain could always bring more. So violent opposition to colonial rule was out of the question for Gandhi. And I think it was also out of the question for Gandhi because he saw violence as something that was never warranted, as ugly, and not the expression of one's true self. So he had an interesting intellectual, strategic, and quasi-religious, or at least spiritual opposition to violence. And this leads him to develop perhaps one of the most important features of the Indian independence movement for the study of contemporary human rights, as well as a key tool in human rights activism, and that is the concept of Satyagraha. Satyagraha. I'll spell it for you, but it's also in the Slack channel. Satyagraha. Satyagraha. Satyagraha literally translates from the ancient Sanskrit as standing in the truth or holding fast to the truth. What it meant for Gandhi, though, and how he explained it when he spoke English, was nonviolence, was active nonviolence, nonviolent resistance. And so he explained it this way once. I've drawn the distinction between passive resistance and understood and practiced in the West and Satyagraha before. So passive resistance, for him, actually, this is a very interesting idea. Passive resistance, you just don't cooperate. Satyagraha is something a little bit more active in its resistance. I've drawn the distinction between passive resistance as understood and practiced in the West and Satyagraha before I'd evolved the doctrine of the latter to its full logical and spiritual extent. I often use passive resistance and Satyagraha as synonymous terms. But as the doctrine of Satyagraha developed, the expression passive resistance ceases even to be synonymous. As passive resistance has admitted of violence, as in the case of the suffragists, and has been universally acknowledged to be a weapon of the weak. For Gandhi, there was no consistency in passive resistance. Passive resistance could include a resort to violence. And the example he gives are the early 20th century first wave feminists in Britain, the suffragists, who were not often, but did use violence in their desire to bring the vote to women. So he says, but also that it's a weapon of the weak, people who see themselves as weak, right? We are too weak to actually affect change, so we're just going to sit and we're going to try to slow it down. We're not going to do anything to cooperate with it. We're going to try to slow it down or stop it or change it just by standing still. Moreover, and this is continuing Gandhi, passive resistance does not necessarily involve complete adherence to the truth under every circumstance. Therefore, it is different from Satyagraha in three essentials. Satyagraha is a weapon of the strong. And as far as Gandhi was concerned, the Indians were strong. They outnumbered the British so much that, Britain, they were as an elephant, and Britain was like a fly in terms of population, in terms of the strength of the people, right, once mobilized. Satyagraha is a weapon of the strong. The second element, essential, is it admits no violence under any circumstance whatsoever. So it is an absolute nonviolence. No matter what happens, one is non-violent. And finally, it ever insists upon the truth. Nonviolence should not be used to push a cynical political agenda. It has to be about something completely and understandably true. Like, leave our country. Like, violence between Christians and Muslims is wrong. Between Muslims and Hindus is wrong. Right? This is the truth that he insists that we stand in. And so it's a good strategy. I mean, in part because it is able to create a really bright line between oppression and the oppressed. Right? And also, there's a certain, well, I'll talk about this, but a certain weakness in taking up arms and losing. Right? So, one of the first times that Gandhi embraced this tactic, among the many, and the one that we most associate with the beginning of the process that brings an end to British colonialism in India, is the 1930 Salt March. Now, salt, we all like it. Put it on your popcorn. Season your food with it. Preserve meat and fish with it. Salt is part of the modern diet of people everywhere, right? I don't know if you've ever stopped for a moment to think where salt comes from, but most salt that we use in the United States and around the world comes from the sea, from water, from ocean water that's been allowed to evaporate, leaving behind salt and other minerals. There's salt works in the South Bay, for example, as you head down towards San Jose. So in India, that was the process as well, but because of colonialism, salt was a colonial monopoly. Because everyone needed it, it was a good way to tax Indians and make money to support the colonial rule of the British. And so Gandhi organized this 250-mile march to the sea and a campaign where Indians made their own salt. And what's interesting is, in making your own salt, you are breaking the law. And this is where there's a difference between passive resistance and this kind of embodied truth that manifests in nonviolence. The Indians were encouraged to make their own salt in order to bypass the salt tax. They were encouraged also, if they were to not resist arrest for doing so, if they were arrested. And this created a kind of it demonstrated to Indians the success of it, because the British tended not to be able to enforce the salt tax if people on the one hand were making their own salt, and the other were willing to go to jail instead of paying it. Now, the salt march was not really successful, and it did expose, I think, the world to one of the terrible drawbacks about a nonviolent approach. And that happened not with India, but at the Kisahwani Bazaar massacre, which happened up in what is today Pakistan. And there, another group of Gandhi's followers, under a Pashtun disciple of his, so Pashtun is one of the languages of Pakistan and Afghanistan, had trained about 50,000 nonviolent activists. And on the 23rd of April in 1930, as part of this effort, they had occupied and had gathered in the Kisakahani Bazaar, the Storytellers Bazaar, and they were sort of gathered, and they didn't have guns, and they were sort of engaged in a non-violent form of protest, and the local British commander ordered his Indian troops to fire upon the crowd, and it killed an estimated 250 people. Now, and in fact, there's two very interesting things that come out of that massacre. One is an American AP reporter was on hand for it and was able to report about it in newspapers around the world, and it really called into question the civilization, if you will, of Britain's occupation of India. How could Britain maintain the high ground in terms of civilization and modernity and Christianity if it ordered non-violent protesters to be fired upon and killed? I mean, the story he tells is that the non-violent activists, according to their training, they just waited there, didn't attack the troops, didn't run away, and were shot. The other is that amongst a portion of the soldiers who had been ordered to shoot, many refused. Right? In ways, to sort of the power bringing them over the men with guns over to the side of the men without. So in that, there is some of the power that can occur in nonviolence. So the Salt March, eventually it didn't work the way Gandhi wanted to, but it did bring about this sort of international attention, and it really forced Great Britain and the British public to reevaluate the wisdom of the continued occupation of India, especially because it was becoming very expensive. And also, and I know that this is one of the questions that you all talk about in section, they began to imagine, the British began to imagine that they could get from India what they wanted without necessarily occupying it. So, first part of the lecture, nonviolence, Satyagraha, developing an Indian identity to confront the divisive identity that the British didn't necessarily create in India, but certainly cultivated India. Gandhi wanted to make one strong, powerful India to oppose possible colonial influence in the future. So, 1946, 1947, World War II is over. Britain really begins in earnest under Lord Mountbatten and General Wavell to negotiate an end to the British in India, and Gandhi's convinced things are going great. And then, towards the very end of negotiation, some say bowing to pressure from Muslims, but I think the general consensus is, as a final act of colonialism, embraced the old Roman imperial concept of divide and conquer, and as India was to be granted independence, it was not just to be one country, it was going to be two. One part of the country was going to be set aside primarily for Muslims, and then the rest, and that would be Pakistan, and the rest would be India. India, in that moment, would not be necessarily associated primarily with Hindus, even though Hindus were the majority religious group in India, but certainly not the majority in terms, that India still had an enormous population of Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, and other religious groups, as well as multiple languages. Whereas Pakistan would become identified almost exclusively with Islam, and non-Muslims in Pakistan would then be forced out. But this process of population exchange after the creation of India was done by both sides. Muslims were attacked in parts of India and then were sent across the border. Hindus were attacked in parts of Pakistan and then sent across the border. Sometimes when those populations collided, there were terrible massacres. Moreover, there was terrible communal violence in many of the big cities of India. And the separation into two countries displaced some 14 million people, and over a very short period of time, left over 2 million people dead. Now, the question is, why draw this map? And in fact, the line between India and Pakistan was not drawn by an Indian or what would become a Pakistani, but rather by a British civil servant. And part of it is that it was calculated to create forms of international and internal instability in both countries. First, the original map of Pakistan. Pakistan was not just the Pakistan we know today. It also included so-called East Pakistan, which is what we today call Bangladesh. And it's just inconceivable to me how any reasonable person would imagine it was going to be possible to run a country separated by, essentially the distance from San Diego to New Orleans in between. So eventually that led to civil war and a break-off of Bangladesh in an extremely, extremely violent period in the 1970s. Moreover, it created tremendous hostility between India and Pakistan. The first manifested in a war over Kashmir, which had been granted to India by its prince, but the majority of the inhabitants were Muslims. And so India and Pakistan go to war, really challenges the new United Nations, and Kashmir, as those of you who follow Indian and Pakistani politics will know, is a place of ongoing tension between Muslims and Hindus, but also has been a source for the creation of terrorist cells that have wreaked havoc in India and also other parts of the Middle East. Now, so India and Pakistan have been on a war footing since 1948, and this has led both countries to invest heavily in their militaries, but also develop nuclear weapons, right? So instead of containing violence, instead of moving to a world of nonviolence like Gandhi had imagined, the separation of these two countries has made two enormous countries both nuclear powers. And finally, it creates internal instability. In Pakistan, this leads to violence against non-Muslims. The most egregious cases of this will often revolve around, more recently, around blasphemy laws, where Christians and others are accused of blasphemy because they may or may not have said something about the Prophet. And in India, this probably has fed into the increasing nationalism and extremism, or Hindu extremism of the ruling BJP party, where instead of embracing the Gandhian notion of an India for all, based on democracy and citizenship, an India based primarily on being Hindu. So, we'll be sharing maps around about this, and I'm going to show a couple of videos in the question period afterwards. But I want to take a moment, to share with you a brief story about something I watched recently. I think in my free time, I like to watch documentaries. And one of these documentaries was about the Freedom Riders, who were people who sought to integrate public accommodations in the American South during the time of Jim Crow by creating young men, young women, black and white, would ride buses and try to integrate public accommodations. And you can just imagine, this is the era where you could see a waiting room for coloreds and a waiting room for whites. You can see drinking fountains for coloreds, drinking fountains for whites, using the 1940s through 1960s pejorative word primarily for African Americans. So they did this, but they also adopted, as much of the American Civil Rights Movement did in that era, the tactic of Satyagraha, of nonviolence, very explicitly so. And in this case, it wasn't, the person we most associate this was Martin Luther King, but really the individual who brought the nonviolence idea into American use was the Reverend James Lawson, who was a professor at Fisk University in Nashville, which is a historically black university, although it's becoming more mixed. And so they had originally been interested, his students and he had originally done, as kind of a school project, they integrated public accommodations in their hometown of Nashville. But before they did it, the Reverend Lawson, being a good college professor, understood from studying Gandhi that it wasn't enough just to ask people to be nonviolent, right? To just be willing to be nonviolent. But you had to be taught how to be nonviolent. And one of the most striking images from that time, and I'm really hoping at some point I can find a copy of this to share with future students, is a record of how the people who were going to do the integration, who were going to sit at a lunch counter and face terrible slurs and maybe be hit or have coffee poured on them, would still remain calm and nonviolent. And I've always wondered, I've always admired people's ability to do that. Like, I would just get up and, it'd be very hard for me not to do something. And I saw how they did it. They practiced. They sat in a room, a college classroom like we used to be able to sit in, and they practiced over and over again. A person would be sitting at a table, someone would come in and reenact an attack by a racist. They'd be called terrible things. They'd be hit. They'd be thrown to the floor. And it's horrible to watch, but then you realize that this is where strength lies, right? That preparation, that practice, that learning how to be nonviolent. Those are the strong. Because I can assure you that violence doesn't have to be taught. Violence is easy. The way of the strong, the way of those with the power of truth, right? They have to learn how to be that. And that's my concluding thought for you, which is that if we commit to engage in nonviolence, we also have to commit to prepare ourselves for it, to practice, right? To ready ourselves, to get a good pair of marching shoes. All right, we'll turn the camera off and we'll start class again.